Dear students, good morning. This is the class for af1, May the 26th, 2020. This is our last class, so I wanted to remind you of a couple of things. Remember that you have to book your exam, and that's going to be, there are several dates in which you can try your exam. One is the 24th of June at 2 p.m. The other one is the 20th of July. And then there are other dates in September, but always make sure to check on af1. af1 is the system that you use to book your exams. You've already used it during the first semester, and then since this is the last class, for further information, for further communications, I'm going to use the email. I might post some short videos also on YouTube, and also I'm going to post on Moodle and my pagina personale docente. I want to show you what my pagina personale docente looks like. Okay, so you see that there is, you go to the university's website, you click on pagina personale or bacheca avvisi. I usually post it on both. And so you see that there are lots of news here, and they're not always in order. So when you're looking for something, always make sure that you use the find option. Okay, for instance, I don't know, let's say that you're looking for the playlist that I use for YouTube. Okay, you write playlist here and then it will find it for you. And you can send me an email for anything else. Remember to download Microsoft Teams. Don't use the web version because it doesn't have all the options. On the date of the exam, well, let's say that in the second half of June, I'm going to send you an email, and I'll post on pagina personale docente in Moodle because I'm going to divide you in groups. So, of course, there are lots of students and I have lots of courses. So the official date is June the 24th, for instance, if you choose that date. But then I'm going to divide you into groups. I don't know, from 4 to 5 I can do 7 exams. Then I'm going to move them to the day after and so on. It's going to take some time, but we'll make it, don't worry. Going back to what we were, and make sure that you always check the email that you've given the university for communications, okay? Because that's important. That's the only way you can know about what's going on if you don't check my pagina personale. But anyway, what did we talk about yesterday? We talked about how English is used as a lingua franca in education, especially at university, and what are the proposals that scholars have for teaching English as a lingua franca at university. The main idea for all the scholars, because we studied 3 of them, is that you have to use English, that teachers and students have to focus on English as a means of communication, so they should not focus on errors. And you always have to consider that whatever language you speak conveys the culture that you come from. And then I also gave you some questions to answer, but I'm also interested in comments and suggestions for this course, because I usually teach something different. I do more semantics, pragmatics, or other grammar aspects like phonetics, morphology, and so on. So this is the first year that I teach something about English, varieties of English. So if you have any recommendations, things that you would add, things that you would leave out, just send me a comment. And yes, it's been a special year, I would say. So I'll also consider the means of communication that we had to use. And that will be useful for the years to come. We also talked about CLIL, Content and Language Integrated Learning, where English is used to teach other subjects, and there are also separate classes for English. This means that students have to have have to be quite knowledgeable in English and in the subjects that they are learning in order to get a good amount of information, most information as possible. And we looked at how English as a lingua franca is considered at university, and I gave you some questions about that. Now, moving on to today's class, we're going to go back to varieties of English. Remember that you have to study 3 varieties of English specifically. You can use songs, you can use movies, literature. You have to know the rules of the language, of course, and then I'm going to ask you some general questions. Remember that the first part of the exam, about 5 minutes, is going to be on the use of language. So please use your mother tongue teacher's Moodle and the exercises to study. Remember that you have to attend Professor Haslam's exercises. And then I would also recommend using Professor Buosso's exercises because he's doing the other part, the other group that is learning the same thing, basically. As for today, we're going to talk about India, Hong Kong, and China's English. So, English users in India are about 330 million. This means a lot of people, actually more than English speakers in the United States. And to give you a little bit of history here, remember that we talked about the Macaulay's Minutes of 1835. This was basically a resolution that gave a sort of language policy for India. And this is what it's about. We must at present do our best to form a class who may be interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern. A class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. To that class we may leave it to refine the vernacular dialects of the country, to enrich those dialects with terms of science borrowed from Western nomenclature, and to render them by degrees fit vehicles for conveying knowledge to the great mass of population. So take a second to read that one silently, please. So what happened? Leap forward more than 100 years, we're in 1947. And that starts the independence of India. And in the 1950s, the Constitution of India declared Hindi as the official national language. However, for another 15 years, English was still used for official purposes. After 17 years, the Official Languages of Amendment Act established that English was the associate official language, together with another 18 regional languages. So they had the same rights. They could work as official languages for the states. More interestingly, from a linguistic point of view, we have to consider the Indianization of English. This means that, yes, Indian people did use British English, but there were cases in which British English was deficient, meaning it did not have the words to express what these people wanted to say. And so, what happens from a language point of view? Well, that leads to code switching and code mixing. So code switching, you start talking in one language and then you continue in the other. Code mixing, you mix the words of both languages within the same utterance, within the same conversation. So I'm going to give you some examples, and I'm not going to read them out loud, obviously, because I don't know how to speak Indian English, but I will give you some seconds to read through it and then give you some explanations about it. This first case that we're going to analyze comes from a newspaper advertisement, Indian newspaper advertisement. Okay. From the point of view of the language that is used, I want you to notice what I was saying before, some cases of code mixing, where this word over here, and then I want you to notice the word issueless. That means childless, without children. Also, notice the words very fair and same case. Okay, that should make you think. Also, just like I told you at the beginning of the course when we talked about Indian English, this type of English is characterized by lots of politeness formulae that are not used in other varieties of English that are very typical of this region. Like, it will not be out of place to request you to send us the details of chemicals, for instance, or kindly please advise me. Remember that I told you about sir and madame, that is used a lot. I invite your kind attention. I respectfully submit the following few lines in favor of your kind consideration. Okay, so very polite formula. Or honorifics, like the ones that you see here. So some of these forms come directly from Indian English, from Indian languages, sorry. And they are then used for a polite form, for a polite style. You can notice that there is this suffix that comes from Indian and that is added to the end of hello, thank you, or the honorific, actually also to doctor, and then the honorific that is added after doctor, Sahib, that means sir. Some cases of code switching and code mixing. You can see them here. Good morning, and then they switch into Indian English. I haven't seen you for a long time. I was away in Delhi. There was a selection committee meeting. Well, you can see that not everybody accepts English as an Indian language. It is not a universal thing. For instance, we can read this section from this Indian writer that is about people are beginning to think in English. Well, the question is, can an Indian really think in English? As far as thinking is concerned, one can only think in one's mother tongue. Since English is an alien tongue to every Indian, no Indian can claim to think in English, because it is linguistically next to impossible to be equally at ease with the target language, which English is, for every Indian. I've been speaking Persian right from my childhood. In fact, Persian was the first language I picked up. My Persian is as good as that of a native speaker of Iran and Central Asia, and it's replete with typical native idiosyncrasies and idioms of written and colloquial Persian. Yet Persian is not the language of my consciousness, though I do my own written work mostly in this language. My mother tongue, which is Bengali, always comes to me naturally, and it predominates my thinking process. Likewise, however good one may be at English, he can't have that native sensibility. So my question for you for this section is, in your opinion, is Indian English a new language? Would you describe it as a single language or a mixed language? A new variety, something else? How would you define Indian English? Now, let's move on to Hong Kong English. Again, this is just deepening what I've already explained during the course, okay? It's that this last part of the book gives further details about the main languages that were explained during the first part. But anyway, about Hong Kong English. Hong Kong has about 7 million inhabitants. 2.5 million people speak English in Hong Kong, more or less. From a historical point of view, Hong Kong is no longer a British Crown colony since 1997. However, Hong Kong has used English since 1842 to the First World War. It was a colony. So, sorry, excuse me. I got lost there. English, since 1842, has been used in its government. It was the language of government, of the law, of education. But during the two world wars, China created an elite that had studied according to the Western rules, but according to Western education. And that's why, since the 1960s, English has become the use of the language of communication for L2 speakers. Hong Kong has always been very strict for the rules that have to be applied, that have to be used in English. Okay? They aim at correctness, and by correctness they mean using the rules of British English. That means that lots of native English speakers from the inner circle are imported, okay? Especially from Great Britain. There's this scholar, Schneider, that has talked about the dynamic model of evolution of new Englishes. He established that post-colonial English goes through 5 stages of development. And then he studies Hong Kong. So he says that a post-colonial English goes through the stage of foundation, when it's used, exonormative stabilization, okay, so it imports rules, nativization, endonormative stabilization, means that it gets its own rules, and then differentiation. It becomes something different. As for the case of Hong Kong, Hong Kong is at stage 3, nativization. This means, nativization means that their English is starting to get a distinct vocabulary, different vocabulary that is not used in British English, okay? This means that Hong Kong English, even if they are trying to import native speakers, even if they are very strict and they apply the rules, this English is actually, this post-colonial English is actually going somewhere else. It is evolving, it's getting features of its own, and it could get away from the rules of British English. No one can basically stop a language. This is what Schneider says. And now let's get into the last section that looks at the future of Englishes and the role of English as a language killer or a language promoter. According to David Crystal's book, Language Deaths, published 20 years ago, recent estimates, referring to the year 2000, recent estimates of the number of languages in the world vary between 3,000 and 10,000. But by most definitions of a language, the figure lies between 6,000 and 7,000. Okay, so the data, according 20 years ago, were said that there were about 6,000, 7,000 languages. Over the next century, something like 2 languages will die each month. A quarter of the world's languages are spoken by fewer than 1,000 people. Okay, so you see there are not many speakers of most of these languages. Though estimates vary, there may still be close to 200 indigenous languages in use in North America. Okay, so 200 are indigenous languages in the United States. So my questions for you are: to what extent do you believe that exploitation by the Anglophone countries has been responsible for causing speakers the death of other languages? Let's get this one. And then I want you to give me a comment about this quote from Nettle and Roman. Those who control particular linguistic resources are in a position of power over others. Linguistic capital, like all other forms of capital, is unequally distributed in society. The higher the profit to be achieved through knowledge of a particular language, the more it will be viewed as worthy of acquisition. The language of the global village, or MIC-world, as someone has called it, oh, that's cute, is English. Not to use it is to risk ostracization, for the benefits of the global economy. I want to read this other quote from Nettle and Roman. Educational policy is another striking example of misguided strategies imported from the West into developing countries. Believing that tribal languages stood in the way of unity and were not suitable as languages of education and technology essential for the Western-style development, most newly independent countries did not develop their own languages, but continued using the language of their former colonizers, even when most of their citizens did not know them. Western policies and practices have generally reinforced European languages. Development agents sent into the field rarely bother to learn the local languages, which leads to communication problems. The World Bank and International Monetary Fund seldom make reference to the possible role indigenous languages might play in development. The use of Western school curricula in developing countries tends to devalue traditional culture and excludes formal study of traditional knowledge systems. Younger members of the culture are educated to believe that traditional knowledge is not worth learning because it will not lead to a job. This other quote instead is from Fishman, 2001. So I'm going to read a series of quotes and then ask you to tell me, to say something, to write me something about your opinion. Globalization is the wave of the future. More than one recent newspaper headline has announced, and to some extent this is so. But globalization is both a constructive and destructive phenomenon, both a unifying and a divisive one. And it is definitely not a cultural, neutral, or impartial one. In our day and age, it is definitely the globalization of pan-Western culture, and pop consumer culture in particular, that is the motor of language shift. And since America-dominated globalization has become the major economic, technological, and cultural thrust of worldwide modernization and westernization, efforts to safeguard threatened languages, and therefore inevitably contextually weaker languages, must oppose the very strongest processes and powers that the world knows today. That, in a word, is exactly why it is so hard to save threatened languages. And the last quote, I think. Yes. Although the English language is not directly responsible for much of the threat to global diversity, it is intimately connected with the processes of economic globalization which are indirectly causing lesser used languages to disappear. The English language has more direct responsibility for language loss in its native-speaking countries. Canada, the USA, and Australia each have a large number of indigenous languages within their borders, which have already been lost or are on the verge of disappearance. In Australia, for example, more than 200 languages are thought to have been lost in recent years. In order to investigate motivations for language revitalization, as well as its outcomes, it is necessary to consider questions such as the following. Okay, sorry, I got into reading mode and I forgot what I was saying. So these are the questions that basically I want you to answer, if you have time and if you want, of course. Do you think, and why do you think, language revitalization is desirable? Actually, let me change these questions because they're also referring to a part that I haven't done. We'll go like this. Is language revitalization desirable? And what do you think about these comments that we've just read? Actually, I would add this. Who should promote it? Now, related to the future of English, there's this theory called English knowing bilingualism. Again, there's Castro involved in this theories. And this aims at making people aware of the importance of keeping their indigenous languages. So there are two patterns that we're going to see here. And they both talk about standard and non-standard varieties of English. This is how they are divided. This is the traditional division of Englishes, okay? So there is a standard L1 Englishes, okay? Let's say the inner circle Englishes, okay? Where there are only a limited amount of people, limited number of people who speak this variety, okay? Then there are forms of non-standard L1 Englishes. Remember, for instance, what we said about AAB. Then there are standard forms of L2 Englishes, and then non-standard L2 Englishes. That is spoken by the largest amount of people. This is the traditional classification. This is what Castro says about when he refers to English knowing bilingualism. He says, well, we should change this pattern. It should look more or less like this. We are living in a world where English is used by many more people than those who spoke it in the past. So we should put English for international uses at the top of our pyramid, putting it upside down. Then there are standard forms of English that are used for local uses, both as L2s and L1s. It doesn't matter wherever you come from. It's just a standard form of English that is used locally. And then non-standard Englishes. That can be both L2 or L1. It doesn't matter. I can give you an example of this. Okay, English is for international use, lingua franca. Fine. Remember what we said about the two varieties of English that are spoken in Singapore. Singlish and the, what's it called? The variety of the standard variety of English that is spoken in Singapore. We would put the standard variety here and Singlish here. Okay? So you can see that where here, we went from here to here, here we're talking about the actual opposite. Okay, these are all attempts that scholars are doing to define what is happening to English and what could happen to English in the future. So I want you to look at these two schemes and tell me, do you agree with this traditional hierarchy, or do you agree with the traditional hierarchy and how it has been changed considering international communication? And plus, do you think that it is possible to, possible, necessary, and right to speak of standard versus non-standard varieties of English within the same nation? And to abandon this division when you're talking about international uses. We've done then lots of talking about how to use English in the international context and how it makes people speak and communicate and interact. But I just want you to noticed this comment about this association, LINE, Languages is a Network of European Excellence. So what happened? There was this team that from 2006 to 2010 had 9 partners. Okay, they're all from Europe. And they had to use, they were studying, they investigated language diversity in Europe. So what happened? These people had to speak English. It was the only language that they had in common. But surprise, surprise, while they were promoting English as a lingua franca, the results were actually the opposite, even among scholars, because members of the Italian community and the Polish team made friends. And instead of using English, guess what? They started teaching their own languages to each other. So Italians taught Italian to Polish and vice versa. And this shows you, this should give you some good insight about how English is using, about what could happen in other cases. So not only English as a lingua franca, you can't impose it. And then I want to conclude this book and this course with some reflections, some thoughts about the future of Englishes by Pennycook. We all know that history and politics and the economy have influenced the use and the evolution of English. And Pennycook just makes us think about this. Imagine a world where World War II was won by the Germans. Okay? And lots of books and movies have imagined this situation. Pennycook also likes to make us think about the force of English, of how English has been used for economic and political reasons, and how it has evolved based on these 2 factors. However, we should think about this. Nowadays, with the internet, English is not the main language used, at least in the internet world. And so, technology can change our future. The internet is a great source that can change, is a great source that can also give great changes to the economy. Maybe there could be a creation of a global English, also for economic reasons. Maybe in the future we will be using English more and more in the educational field. What scholars imagine for the future of English is that probably the world will move away from the traditional, here she says UK and US Englishes, but actually the inner circle Englishes, and go towards an English that is spoken worldwide with its own rules. And we don't know, maybe it could shift towards a world where Asia is a major player. We don't know. We'll just see what happens in the future. Now, as for today's song, give me a second. We Are the Champions. I've paid my dues time after time. I've done my sentence but committed no crime. And bad mistakes I've made a few. I've had my share of sand kicked in my face, but I've come through. We are the champions, my friend, and we'll keep on fighting till the end. We are the champions. No time for losers, because we are the champions of the world. I've taken my vows and my curtain calls. You've bought me fame and fortune and everything that goes with it. I thank you all, but it's been no bed of roses, no pleasure cruise. I consider it a challenge before the whole human race, and I ain't gonna lose. 1 and 1, and then it repeats and repeats. Let me give you the link a second, and I'll put it in your notes. So here's the link. I'm putting it in your slides over here. Okay. So here's the song. Okay. So this is the end of the course. For further communication, I'm going to use YouTube or the Moodle and my pagina personale docente. If you have any questions, comments, just let me know, and in bocca al lupo per gli esami. See you soon. Take care. Stay healthy. Bye.